Okay, so I guess I can start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abhishek Jain, and I'm pleased to invite you all to the first episode of our series on working with the United Nations by Planty. Towards the end of this session, we will also be having a Q&A session for which I would request you all to put your questions in the live chat box. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Mohit Khubchandani, a graduate of the 2015 batch of Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University, who then went on to pursue his LLM in International and Environmental Law from Stanford Law School in 2018. He has previously worked as a legal consultant at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as a research fellow at the United Nations International Law Commission, and is currently a Stanford Judicial Fellow at the International Court of Justice. In this session, Mohit will be speaking in detail on working with the United Nations, as he has worked with all six of the official organs of the United Nations. He will also be addressing the various opportunities that are available during and after having completed your work at the United Nations. I would now like to hand it over to Mohit to begin the session.
Thank you very much, Planty, for giving me the opportunity to address the audience today on a very, very contemporary and ongoing topic of working with the United Nations. The reason why I say contemporary is because in this year, when the United Nations Charter marks its 75th anniversary, it is also ironically gaining a lot of public eyeballs because of the world facing its biggest ever challenge in the past century or so, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Everybody is looking forward to what the United Nations and particularly the World Health Organization has to do and to say in order to tackle this pandemic. Therefore, I feel that it is only befitting for me to be speaking about such a noble career path to all the listeners today, and particularly those from India who wish to dream of a career at the United Nations. This is also a very significant year for India because it is for the eighth time that the Indian delegation finds itself at the United Nations Security Council from 2021 until 2022, towards its ultimate objective of trying to find a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. So, before I begin, I would once again like to thank Planty for inviting me and for giving such a kind introduction. Now, my address today is divided in three prongs. The first prong relates to generic points which um, people come across and stumble upon when trying to charter a path for the United Nations. The second is more substantive, which would deal with both my experiences as well as the backdrop of the six official organs of the United Nations, as well as the six committees of the United Nations General Assembly. And in the third section, which I personally find to be the most interesting one, is where I would be more than happy and willing to take any questions that you may have. So, before I begin the first part, I would like to begin with a quote of the second Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. He said, I quote, "The UN wasn't created to take mankind into paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell." Unquote. I begin with this because this is the essential thought that prevailed in my mind and still prevails to date when I think of the United Nations, when I go into work every day. And this was and has been the impetus for me to choose this career path. So, without further ado, I would like to take you through some subsections that I have prepared in this particular section of working with the United Nations. So, one of the first questions that I have come across very often is that what are the opportunities available for Indian law students and recent graduates to be involved with the United Nations? Now, while in the former part of my address, I have spoken very highly about this noble path, at the outset, I cannot speak for other fields, but can only share my candid opinion about international law and lawyers. I strongly believe that while it is ambitious and noble to have an aim to be working at the United Nations, I must emphasize that it should not be the only aim. In my opinion, different settings and experiences make one a holistic international law practitioner in the truest sense. Such an approach is, in fact, also important to be able to get to the United Nations. So, if I may, I would like to broaden the scope of this perpetual question I receive to be able to say that what are the opportunities available for Indian law students in international law by and large. So, to begin with, most people, I believe, have a basic filter set in their mind. These two filters include either being in academia or in practice. While it is good to have these filters in order to channelize your efforts, I can confess that I till date have not been able to find such a filter in my mind. So I traverse through both and might continue doing so, even if it means that it makes me less stable. That is because I do not wish to be labeled in either box and want to experience the beauty of traversing through both these fields. Therefore, insofar as the opportunities of specifically young graduates from India are concerned, I think that one could look at the following ways. The first could be looking at the Ministry of External Affairs in India, and particularly their Legal and Treaties Division, which has internships to offer, which I feel are a very valuable learning experience for anybody trying to charter a path towards the United Nations. The next, of course, is research assistantship with international law professors, as you all might be aware of. The next, I would say, this is something that I did prior to doing my master's in law, is working at the office of the law officers of the country. I had the great honor to be working with the Office of the Attorney General for India from 2015 until 2017 before I pursued my LLM from Stanford Law. Just to also give you a backdrop, some universities mandatorily require a minimum work experience before you can pursue that LLM. And in the case of Stanford, it required a minimum of 2 years. And I possessed around that time, around 2.5 years before I began that. There is also one more thing to underscore, which is the mandate of the law officers of the country. They are supposed to defend the government in any national or international cases which are present before the government at the time. And it is therefore always beneficial for anybody dreaming of a career in international law to be trying to work in these settings domestically, while also getting exposure to litigation and municipal law, which I feel is a skill that helps me currently during my work with the International Court of Justice. So I will not go into the details, but when I was working at the Office of the Attorney General, I had the great opportunity to be working on three cases, two before the International Court of Justice and one before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which India was contesting at the time. Now, finally, I feel that young graduates can also look at positions at international NGOs and organizations which exist in India. The ones that come to mind are the International Solar Alliance, the World Wildlife Foundation, WWF, and even so with the United Nations in India. I have particularly noticed that the UNDP and UNICEF offices in New Delhi are great places to find internships for young graduates. So, therefore, I feel that these could be opportunities which one could see as stepping stones. However, it is absolutely imperative to do a master's if you wish to take this passion further. So, then this brings me to the next prong of this part, which is that how should a law student who aspires to work at the UN charter her or his journey, and perhaps what are the essentials that the person could focus upon? I feel that once again, choosing your masters wisely is the key in this context. To be able to strike a balance between your subject preference, the university reputation, and the contemporary topics of international law which are relevant for UN jobs is particularly important. In order to contextualize this, I feel it befitting to give you an example. For example, I had an ardent interest in international space law, and I still do have that. However, I chose not to apply for an LLM in that field, while I don't discourage anybody from doing so. But in my opinion, I felt that if I chose to do an LLM as an Indian attorney in international space law, then insofar as UN opportunities are concerned, it would only make me relevant for an organization such as the UNCOPUS in Vienna. Therefore, because I wanted to maximize my opportunities, not just at the United Nations, but also at international law firms and in arbitration, I decided to pursue an LLM in international and environmental law from Stanford Law School. I also feel that other topics such as human rights law and humanitarian law are those which make several UN opportunities open for you. Now, then again, the existential questions which come into the mind are whether one really wishes to be working at the United Nations. Because if not, then other fields such as international space law are also great fields to thrive in. However, working at the UN itself or international courts and tribunals requires you to charter a path through specialization in certain topics which make you more relevant for those entities. Then next, I feel that a question that is very prevalent is that what really is the selection process that one could undergo in order to be ultimately selected at the United Nations? So I am currently addressing the predicament of young graduates. So what I can say is that, firstly, I can't say with certainty what all is looked at, because otherwise I would have been on the other side. But I'm just sharing some of my impressions. Now, while we are dreaming of working with international organizations, as I have previously touched upon, a master's degree that matches with the profile of the UN entity concerned is very, very helpful. Language skills, which are often ignored, are a huge bonus. And specifically as Indians, we, while usually being native in English, should also endeavor to work on other language skills, preferably French and then Spanish. I say French because, for instance, it is the official working language of the International Court of Justice alongside English. And in fact, none of the other four official languages of the United Nations are official languages at the International Court of Justice. So, this is my initial impression. And once one has interned or has been a consultant at the United Nations for about 3 or 4 years and has had a master's degree, then one is eligible for what they call a P2 position, and so on and so forth. There are P3, P4, and they go on until P5 positions. The more we progress, the easier it is to sustain. However, there are a lot of stumbling blocks in the beginning. And this then takes me to another very interesting concern that people have before thinking of a career at the United Nations, which is that how can they really know if they are suited for a career? Now, once again, very honestly, I don't think that I have an answer to this yet, despite having had the opportunity to have already worked in almost all lenses which could possibly exist at the UN. And I am very, very grateful for having the opportunity to do so. But I must confess to everybody that I did not plan this path such, and nobody can do so. uh, and which, according to me, is perhaps the most beautiful part of my journey. Um, no one can ever plan to work in many different settings so early on in their career. That is also because this path, as you could imagine, comes with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pain and agony, which no one really seeks for. Therefore, it is only incidental that I have been able to tread along this path. Um, and but I also must emphasize that I always had a broad idea about what all are the different opportunities which might take me to the International Court of Justice. But then again, um, I must also emphasize that all my colleagues at the ICJ have had different paths to get here, which perhaps again fortifies the proposition that one should strive for excellence in international law than at the United Nations itself. Then again, it is important for me to mention that this broad mindset, rather than a myopic one, is in fact beneficial to ultimately get to the United Nations. So, however, to answer whether you're suited or not, generally speaking, I believe that if you have an interest in world affairs, in world peace, you love to travel and experience different cultural exchanges, going to different countries, then most certainly the United Nations is your calling. I also find it important right now to bust some common myths about working at the United Nations. So many people are of the opinion that working at the UN is more meaningful than working in other positions and spheres. This is absolutely untrue. It is totally contingent upon your team, the job requirements and profile, and going by the cliche, whether you are at the right place and time. Sometimes you might also feel that you are a small fish in the ocean and might end up feeling insignificant. Then there is another notion that working at the UN is easy go and more relaxed than other jobs. I can tell you already that I've had to work on weekends many times, and mine is nowhere close to a 9 to 5 job. It is simply about delivering work products in the timeline set. Next is another myth that I would like to debunk, which is that working at the United Nations gives you a stable career. Specifically, as an early professional, I can tell you that you are scrambling from one position to another with uncertainties as a consultant. You also don't have benefits which are given to employees who have been working for longer. I can say this to you right now that despite having worked at the United Nations in different settings for 3 years now, I don't know where I am going in the near future. And this is what could come as a path which you're trying to tread. But then there should be no regrets, and you should be ready and willing to be taking all kinds of risks. Um, so, before I conclude this general part of today's discussion, I would like to give some tips to anyone who's interested in this career. So, you could also perhaps take this as a word of caution and advice, if I might put it that way. Working for the United Nations is a very fulfilling career. But once again, I would like to encourage all international lawyers specifically to be working in different positions, such as in academia, in municipal and international litigation and arbitration, in international organizations and NGOs, besides the United Nations. As I mentioned, I still do not know if I will remain with the United Nations for long, and in fact, I am constantly seeking for positions to broaden my horizons and to experience the entire expanse of international law. And this is a very exhilarating part of my journey. And therefore, I would beseech upon students to not look at me as a person to follow, to charter a path to get to the UN, but as perhaps a person who is seeking for manifold experiences in international law and arbitration than one just at the United Nations, which is a facet of it. This is not to say that working at the United Nations is not fulfilling. I wake up every day with a very great feeling about my job and a very proud feeling. But I also find it absolutely imperative to say that working in many, many positions in international law, specifically, not other fields, as I can't speak about them, can really help us in our understanding of the wide expanse of international law. With this, I can now move into the next part of my address today, which is the substantive part about a brief introduction to the United Nations organs and the committees. So, in the beginning, I got a very kind introduction which said that I have worked at all the 6 official organs. So here I would like to clarify a few things. So what I would like to say is that you might all already be aware that the six organs of the United Nations are the United Nations General Assembly, the largest organ, the United Nations Security Council, which perhaps is the most important organ in the sense that it issues binding directives. Then there is the Trusteeship Council, the Economic and Social Council, also known as the ECOSOC, the United Nations Secretariat, which houses a lot of UN agencies, and the sixth and the judicial organ of the United Nations, which is the International Court of Justice, the only one not located in New York and is located at The Hague in Netherlands, where I speak from currently. So, in the interest of time, I will exclude ECOSOC and Trusteeship Council out of the purview of our discussion today, as they hold ceremonial significance now. I have to mention that there are no particular jobs to be working at the ECOSOC or Trusteeship Council, Security Council, or the General Assembly. The only jobs that you can really find are at foreign ministries of countries, at the UN Secretariat, at its various agencies, and international courts and tribunals, and in this sense, the International Court of Justice. And while working through these three settings, one can get an opportunity to be working at all the remaining organs of the United Nations. So, this is just to clarify that no one can be seeking for positions at the General Assembly or Security Council, ECOSOC, or Trusteeship Council. So, nonetheless, I shall now discuss the remaining organs of the United Nations. But before I discuss those, I feel that it is important for me to bring to light, for the ease of operationality, that there are six committees in which the United Nations is broadly defined insofar as the UN General Assembly and Security Council operate. So, very often we see diplomats in missions of countries being assigned to a single committee or committees within the realm of which they operate. For instance, one could be referred to as the sixth committee delegate from Estonia at the United Nations, or in Geneva and New York. So the sixth committee is the legal committee. So I feel that before taking you through the organs, I can contextualize the subject matters which are divided through the six committees. The first committee, therefore, is the Disarmament and International Security Committee. To give you an example, treaties such as the Nuclear Weapons Convention, Non-Proliferation Treaty, an offshoot of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, were a result of deliberations in this committee. Then the second committee deals with economic and financial matters, though in my personal opinion, the word environmental should also be included in the second committee, because many resolutions which have been significant and path breaking, such as the Convention on Biodiversity, resolutions on the effects of El Nino, works done at the Rio and Stockholm Declaration, are the result of workings of the second committee. The third is perhaps the committee with the broadest mandate. It concerns the Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Matters Committee. This is also a committee wherein I had a significant experience. and topics such as education, gender equality, racial discrimination, right to privacy, health, sanitation, issues like terrorism are issues which are considered in this committee. The fourth committee is known as the Special Political and Decolonization Matters Committee. As the name suggests, the scope of this committee is extremely limited. In particular, it deals with matters such as the right to self-determination and sovereign claims of nations over certain regions. So, for instance, the recent Chagos dispute between Mauritius and the United Kingdom could be construed to be a part of the fourth committee. The fifth committee is the Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Matters. This is open to lawyers as it concerns issues of UN budgeting, though this has widespread implications for the United Nations and is hailed towards the success of peacekeeping missions and peace building missions, which also the United Nations has. Finally, the sixth committee. I did not mean to leave this for the last, but it comes in its chronology. But this is the legal committee and most important for international lawyers. Um, this committee is responsible for deliberation of all legal treaties that concern humankind, for to say in the broadest possible terms. Uh, each and every form of international law as we know it has been enacted in this committee. Um, the delegates of committees are known as legal advisors for a permanent mission to the United Nations in this committee, as opposed to other delegates who are considered as diplomats of a particular committee. I had the great fortune of working in this modality with the Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations in New York. Um, with this brief introduction about the committees, I would now like to proceed to the remaining four organs, which I mentioned that I will be discussing today. So, beginning with the United Nations General Assembly, in many ways, this is the principal organ of the United Nations, where each and every of the 193 members, in fact, including observer states, find a seat and an equal voice. Resolutions of the General Assembly are adopted through the practice and procedures set out under Chapter 4 of the United Nations Charter. The voting in the General Assembly on certain important questions, such as resolutions on peace and security, budgetary concerns, election, admission, suspension, or expulsion of members, is always done by a two-third majority of those present and voting. Now, there is a distinction. Other than these concerns, other questions are decided by a simple majority. Um, each member has one vote, um, and apart from approval of budgetary matters, including adoption of scale of assessment, assembly resolutions are not binding on members. So, in order to emphasize, sans the budgetary resolutions, every other resolution is uh, is in the form of a recommendation. Um, However, I must emphasize that even though these resolutions are not binding, They are imperative from the international law perspective. These resolutions are also known as soft law and help putting in forth a global statement towards formation of international law. They are often considered to be reflective of both opinion juris and state practice of nations in determining norms of customary international law. Um, this position was also fortified by the International Court of Justice in the famous case concerning the military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua. Many a time, resolutions of the UN General Assembly are later culminated into conventions and treaties, such as the Rio Declaration and such as the Outer Space Treaty. Um, and therefore, voting at the United Nations General Assembly resolutions is a key component in order to examine the existence of any international legal norm. The next organ, which is the United Nations Security Council, and perhaps the most powerful organ, as I mentioned, has the primary responsibility of maintenance of international peace and security. It has 15 members, and each member has one vote. Um, every member has a 2-year term, and um, this excludes the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council, namely the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. So, in this aspect, while we are speaking of the Security Council, I feel I should address an existential concern, which is the power of veto that is vested with with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And I'm certain that everybody here would have heard of this predicament that exists. Um, but all that I can say is that there needs to be a restructuring, um, significant reforms in this aspect. And I genuinely do believe that, uh, especially when there is a country concerned who happens to be one of the permanent 5 members in an ongoing international concern, then that country should not be able to be a judge in its own cause and veto certain resolutions. Um, Continuing with the mandate of the United Nations Security Council, it performs the important functions of determining the existence of threat to peace or any act of aggression. It calls upon parties to a dispute to settle them by peaceful means. Um, in some cases, the Security Council can also resort to imposition of sanctions and sometimes even authorize use of force to maintain or restore international peace and security. Unlike the United Nations General Assembly resolutions, the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council are binding. Generally speaking, the work of the first and the fourth committee of the United Nations, which I spoke to you about, are comprised of the working of the United Nations Security Council. Next, I would like to speak about the International Law Commission, even though it does not form a part of the 6 organs of the United Nations, but I feel that this is one body that all international lawyers must be aware of, specifically also as working opportunities. So, as per Article 13.1 of the Charter of the United Nations, The International Law Commission, which also has its own statute, is set up to carry forth studies for the progressive development and codification of international law. And there are 34 members who are elected at the United Nations General Assembly, and they work at the International Law Commission, not as representatives of their countries after election, but as independent legal practitioners of high repute. And the mandate of the International Law Commission is, as I mentioned, to carry forward these researches. There are certain questions which can be referred to by the Security Council or the General Assembly to the International Law Commission through the Sixth Committee of the United Nations. And countries can also give recommendations for development of certain issues. Now, the seat of the International Law Commissions is at the Palais des Nations at the United Nations, Geneva, and typically the sessions of the International Law Commission go from April to August every year. The next is the sixth and the judicial organ of the United Nations, which I'm sure you all are aware of, the International Court of Justice. It has 15 members from the various countries which contest elections, both at the United Nations and the General Assembly and the Security Council. These members, who are the judges at the court, are selected for a 9-year term, which could be renewed with fresh elections. The International Court of Justice primarily concerns two kinds of disputes which it finds adjudicated before it. The first are contentious disputes. In other words, disputes which are brought by sovereign nations before the International Court of Justice, pursuant to Article 36 of the Charter of the Statute of the International Court of Justice. And the next kind of jurisdiction that the International Court of Justice has is through advisory proceedings. Advisory proceedings can be on any issue of international law on which the United Nations Security Council or the General Assembly has requested a clarification upon, and therefore this is how the ICJ functions, in close coordination with the UNSC and the UNGA. I will now get to the last part of my address to you today, and this concerns what all are the activities which one could do or undertake in order to maximize her or his opportunities to get selected at the United Nations. This might be known to you all, but I feel that when we look at a resume, we are trying to look at quality more than quantity and diversity in the kinds of experiences that we might have had. So taking part in international moot courts, specifically those that have mandates and simulations of the International Court of Justice, can be very handy, such as the Philip C. Jessup, Manfred Lax, Vis Vienna, not Vis Vienna, sorry, that concerns commercial arbitration, and Stetson are great opportunities for young law students. Model United Nations internships at the places that I mentioned already. Um, and to end, I would like to quote a very, very famous quote from the movie Rocky Balboa, which I think I almost always resonate with. And it says, quote, "It's not about how hard you can hit, but it is about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward," unquote. Um, I say so in the end because a career in international law and at the United Nations, specifically for Indian law graduates, is a tough path to charter, but a very, very rewarding one. And with this, I would like to end the first two segments of my address today and would be more than happy and willing to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, Mohit. That was truly a wonderful session. I think you've covered the details of every single organ of the United Nations and also what the work actually entails, which would really help someone in deciding as to where exactly they would fit best. So, thanks a lot. We do have a couple of questions. I think the first question is actually particularly interesting because most, like, I mean, for example, law is actually an undergrad degree in India, right? Now, most students, however, when they try to apply for the United Nations or any of their internships, they realize that these internships are only available after you finish your first degree or your first undergraduate degree. So, what would you recommend that these students could do in terms of internships that might simulate the kind of work that they would get when they work with the United Nations?
Thank you very much for your question. And I feel that the best way for me to answer this would be to narrate to you my own experience. So, it is indeed true that the law degrees in India are seen differently. And you would be surprised to learn that even for internships at the United Nations, specifically in New York, there is a lot of competition. So I graduated in 2015, then I worked for close to 3 years as a lawyer registered with the Bar Council of India. And after that, I pursued my LLM with Stanford Law School. And even then, I could enter into the United Nations through unpaid internships. Though I must confess that I perhaps am coming from a position of privilege here because my family was very kind and benevolent to support me during such times. But the point that I wish to underscore here is that students should not be in a hurry to get to the United Nations because that sometimes does not yield our desired results and in fact only gives disappointment. So working at other international organizations and entities such as the Foreign Ministry or the offices of the law officers of India are paths which one can take up after graduation or perhaps do a master's immediately after graduation and then try to pitch for such positions which can put us in good stead for such positions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Mohit. I think the next question that I have is again a very specific question, actually. So, in India, most of us often only learn English as, let's say, another language that we might learn. Do you think that, let's say any kind of experience with, or let's say learning languages like French or Spanish would actually add on to your resume in terms of actually increasing your chances for getting a job or an internship with the United Nations?
Thank you for this question. And once again, I think that I cannot answer this in any better way than speaking of my own experience. Um, I was applying for a position at the International Court of Justice for the past 3 years in a row, and I have no hesitation to say that. And the only difference in my third application was my proficiency in French. So perhaps this says something about the selection procedures. It is very, very important for Indian lawyers to realize the value of particularly French and then perhaps Spanish while they are trying to charter such a path at the United Nations. Though I do not mean to put any pressure, because ultimately the kind of work that is expected from Indian lawyers who are Anglophones is not working in the French language, but knowing it enough to be able to maneuver through conversations, basic emails, and instructions which are given to us in French, but the work that we do is in English. So, insofar as you can build more than a basic level of understanding of these languages, it is very, very handy to get all such positions. Thanks.
All right, yeah, I think that definitely answers that question too. And I think this brings me to the last question for today's Q&A session. So you mentioned that mooting is definitely one of those activities that helps demonstrate your interest in international law, and also probably help you understand as an individual that this is something you want to do for the long term. What are, let's say, some of the other activities or extracurriculars that you think a law student could do, or rather should do, to actually better understand their interests and also increase their chances?
Okay, thank you for this question. So, I initially touched upon these activities before closing my first part of the address. Um, but the one activity that I would like to, in fact, caution against to young law students is to not be disheartened or pressurized uh, if they are unable to find selections in good publication journals. And this is a predicament that every young law practitioner or student faces. What I can tell you is that you can have publications all your life, but there are certain activities which you can only undertake as a law student and not when you're outside law school. And therefore, I feel that if you are very true and honest to your research, in particularly moot court competitions, then the research that you have through these moot court competitions, regardless of the fact whether you obtained a merit in that particular moot or not, is something that will always stay with you, both intellectually as well as a resource bank, which you can develop later on in your career to have great publications. And so I would definitely recommend publications, um, but not really focus on this aspect which universities ask for, and that's why students think about having. And universities are also mindful of the fact at which stage a student is in her or his career, and therefore publications can be according to that. So after having given this word of caution, other activities which I feel are important are activities which are out of the box, as in setting up societies by yourself. Um, these days, I find a lot of young law students setting up their own YouTube channels and their own blogs initiatives, such as yours, which is something that I never contemplated in my early days. So I can only commend you for that. And these kind of activities indeed are also things which can reflect very well in applications we when we are trying to get admissions for masters. And The rest is something that I touched upon already, perhaps, such as Model United Nations, and not to forget trying to have basic grades, which are imperative also to crack through these positions, and grades specifically in subjects of international law which you are passionate about. And lastly, I would also say that this might be a mandatory activity, but perhaps it goes without saying that any thesis that you may be required to write in your law school should, or perhaps could, be in a contemporary issue of international law which you might want to um, further in your studies or through your professional working aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohit, for answering these questions. And I think that does bring me to the end of the Q&A session. So thanks a lot for that. And thank you once again for taking out the time from your busy schedule and actually coming in and talking to us about working at the United Nations and sharing your experience. Trust me when I say that this has been very, very useful, and it's going to guide and help a lot of students who are going to view this video and then accordingly make a lot of decisions. So thanks once again, Mohit.
Thank you once again for having me here, and I am very, very grateful to you. And I hope that whoever is listening, including your entire team, remains safe and healthy in these troubling times. And I would like to end with a positive connotation, which is that working at the United Nations is indeed a very, very noble path, but it is not the only path. And it can also be achieved as a path later on in one's career. Sometimes it happens early on in someone's career, but it is also ultimately about being at the right place and time, having patience, and just striving for excellence in international law more than anything else. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Mohit.